Welcome back to the Autonomous Mind podcast. So today we're jumping straight into our deep dive of Chapter 2 of Ben Shirgle's book, The Autonomous Mind.
Right, and this specific chapter is titled The Path of the Variables. And, I mean, it really demands a fundamental recalibration of how you understand the concept of physical decline.
Yeah, it really does. Because
Yeah.
normally, when we think of a major medical shift or the onset of a chronic condition, we just naturally imagine it as an ambush.
Exactly, like a sudden, violent disruption of normalcy.
Right, the phone call from a doctor or a sudden collapse or maybe an unexpected blood test that ruthlessly divides a person's life into a clear before and after.
But Ben Shirgold is presenting a completely different reality here. We're analyzing how a systemic biological shift, specifically the rare genetic parameters of Wolfram Syndrome, does not happen as a sudden ambush at all.
No, it manifests as this really slow, sequential tightening of architectural variables.
Which is the critical distinction we have to establish right from the outset. Because to really understand the autonomous mind, we have to grasp the fundamental difference in how Ben Shirgold actually experiences reality.
And more specifically, how his neurological architecture processes time and memory, right?
Exactly. For the first few years of his life, his internal system ran on what we might consider standard operational loops. I mean, he was a child interacting with the world. He played, he learned, he observed.
But at the microscopic level, his genetic timeline was already mapping out a highly specific future.
Right, and for a neurotypical mind, childhood medical checks are entirely ephemeral. Think about your own earliest memories of a doctor's office. They're hazy, right?
Oh, absolutely. Just blurry memories of cold offices, maybe the sharp smell of rubbing alcohol.
Yeah, and half-understood terms spoken by adults hovering above you. The neurotypical brain actively prunes those mundane details to save cognitive load.
But Ben Shirgold possesses a hyperthymetic memory, so clinically that's known as HSM, or highly superior autobiographical memory.
And his internal database does not prune. It logs every single diagnostic coordinate, every hospital sent, the exact cadence of a physician's voice, and every clinical timeline in flawless, absolute data retention.
So we are completely removing nostalgia from the equation here. I mean, we aren't talking about the emotional, reconstructed memories that you or I rely on to build the narrative of our childhoods.
No, not at all. Every time we recall a memory, we actually rewrite it slightly, shading it with our current emotions. But for Ben Shirgold, we are talking about raw data caching.
Exactly. And we need to be incredibly precise about the timeline here because it's so easy to conflate his current understanding with his childhood experience.
That is a crucial point. During his childhood, Ben Shirgold had absolutely zero advanced medical understanding of his long-term prognosis. None.
Right. We can't look at this timeline and assume he was some sort of child prodigy, standing in a hospital room actively analyzing his own biological decline in real time.
Exactly. His hyperthymetic memory simply recorded these events as flawless, objective, raw data points in a sequence. The sensory input, the exact phrasing of the doctors, the environmental variables of the room.
They were just ingested and stored perfectly by his hippocampus and amygdala. But the structural meaning of that data, the overarching narrative of Wolfram Syndrome, was completely absent.
It was only much later in life, long after his formal diagnosis, that his internal system integrated those pieces of cached data to understand the timeline retrospectively.
I really want to pause and unpack the psychological weight of that reality because possessing absolute data permanence without any contextual framework is just a staggering concept.
It really is.
If we think about how modern computing works, the best analogy I can construct for Ben Shirgold's childhood memory is, well, it's like a computer that is automatically caching fragmented lines of code in the background for years.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right. The operating system is quietly downloading these encrypted files, storing them on the hard drive, completely unaware of what the final software program will actually look like.
Because that executable file isn't going to be triggered for a decade.
Exactly. So he is walking around carrying the exact blueprint of his own systemic biological shift, perfectly preserved on his hard drive, but it's entirely unreadable to him until the cipher is finally provided years later.
The cipher being the ultimate formal diagnosis, yes. But the code itself began downloading extremely early, which brings us to the first tangible indicator of his shifting physical blueprint.
Right, which in the autonomous mind, Ben Shirgold identifies as the 4-year target.
Yes. The data anchors cleanly and objectively at the Mater Calvary Hospital in Waratah. He was exactly 4 years old at the time.
And because of his hyperthymetic engine, The file for this specific event is immaculate. I mean, he recalls the sterile clinical environment of that specific hospital room at Mater Calvary perfectly.
The harsh lighting, the specific institutional hum of the machinery.
Yeah, but he juxtaposes that clinical sterility with the constant, comforting presence of his mom, who stayed the night beside his bed.
It's a very striking image. The warmth of human connection and maternal protection operating right alongside the cold, unyielding reality of biological data collection.
It really is a profound juxtaposition, but we have to look at the medical mechanics of why a 4-year-old is in that room overnight.
Right. The medical staff at Mater Calvary Hospital in Waratah were not dealing with an acute crisis. This was not an emergency room scenario where a sudden physical trauma required immediate life-saving stabilization.
So what were they actually looking for?
They were tracking a baseline fluctuation in his blood chemistry. The output of that stay, the definitive metric handed down by the pediatric physicians, was that 4-year-old Ben Sheargold was borderline hyperglycemic.
Borderline hyperglycemic. I mean, a sequence of syllables that means absolutely zero to a 4-year-old boy sitting in a hospital bed.
Zero context for the child.
Yeah.
But borderline hyperglycemia in pediatric endocrinology is a massive red flag.
Because it implies the pancreas is struggling.
Exactly. It implies that the pancreas is struggling to produce adequate insulin to manage glucose levels, but it hasn't completely failed yet.
Right.
The physicians delivered what we can best describe as a conditional logic statement to his parents. They explicitly stated that his ultimate metabolic trajectory was entirely dependent on how his hormones responded to puberty.
Which is terrifying.
It is. If we analyze this through the lens of systems architecture, they were pointing to a silent biological clock set by his genetics. The clock is ticking in the background of his physiology, perfectly hidden.
And while it ticks, his childhood processing centers remain focused simply on navigating the physical world around him. You know, learning to read, playing, just being a 4-year-old.
Precise.
I have to challenge that framing a bit, though. You call it architectural and you talk about systems architecture, but that sounds far too clean.
What do you mean?
Well, it sounds too sterile for what is actually happening. For his parents, receiving that conditional logic statement isn't architecture. It's a ticking time bomb that they have to watch their child play next to for 10 years.
That's a fair point.
The chilling reality of a biological trigger being delayed for a decade is profound. It's effectively an unbreakable physical contract signed at age 4 that will not come due until adolescence.
The psychological toll of that must be immense.
Right. The parents have to carry the immense psychological weight of that knowledge. They are holding their breath for 10 years, waiting to see how the hormonal variables of puberty will execute while the child simply exists.
Flawlessly recording the data of his life,
Yeah.
but blissfully blind to the impending execution point.
Exactly.
You're highlighting the emotional asymmetry between the parents and the child there, which is entirely valid. The parents are burdened with the context, while Ben Sheargold simply holds the raw data.
Yeah, that is the nature of genetic predisposition.
Specifically within the parameters of Wolfram Syndrome, as explored in the autonomous mind. It ruthlessly removes the illusion of random chance from human health and replaces it with deterministic biology.
And Ben Sheargold maps this determinism chronologically. The first variable, the borderline hyperglycemic metric, is cached at age 4 at Waratah.
Correct. We then see the chronological tightening of the variables when we progress to the second major shift, which occurred when Ben was in the 5th grade.
Right, this is where we see the first visual adjustment. But again, to tie back to the theme of the autonomous mind, he frames this not as a sudden catastrophe.
No, it isn't waking up one morning unable to see.
It's a subtle, almost insidious degradation of the existing system.
And we must maintain strict timeline accuracy here to understand the progression of his condition. In the 5th grade, this was not a sudden loss of visual data.
No.
It was a subtle drop in lens clarity resulting in a short-sighted diagnosis and his first pair of prescription glasses.
Which is important to clarify because at this specific point in the timeline, Ben Sheargold's right eye had absolutely not gone completely blind.
Exactly. Furthermore, his left eye had not dropped below its 5.0% blurred contrast baseline.
Right. Those severe degradations belong to a much later stage of the condition. In the 5th grade, he was simply a young boy experiencing a very common childhood rite of passage going to the optometrist and getting glasses.
Yes. If you're listening to this and you wear glasses, think about when you first got them as a kid. It's probably just a minor annoyance.
Right. Maybe you couldn't read the chalkboard from the back of the classroom, you got fitted for frames, and life moved on.
Exactly. To his classmates, and perhaps even to his teachers, Ben getting glasses was just that, a mundane childhood event. It's a completely standard operational adjustment that millions of kids go through.
But inside Ben Sheargold's rigorously logging system, this event was the first tangible indicator that his visual bandwidth required external augmentation.
I want to focus on why that distinction matters. In Wolfram Syndrome, the visual degradation is typically caused by optic atrophy.
Okay.
The optic nerve, which carries visual information from the eye to the brain, begins to degenerate. So the hardware itself is failing at a cellular level.
Right.
When he gets those glasses in the 5th grade, he is no longer able to process the visual data of the world using solely his organic systems.
He requires a synthetic overlay, the prescription lenses, to correct the degradation and artificially boost his visual acuity back to a functional baseline.
Exactly. And this is where the genius of his hyperthymetic memory truly reveals the architecture of his decline. He does not view these events in isolation.
Because the variables are layering over one another. And that is the terrifying part of the architecture. This visual drop in the 5th grade does not erase or overwrite the Waratah metric.
No, it doesn't.
That borderline hyperglycemic data point from age 4 is still silently caching in the background. His pancreas is still under whatever genetic stress was flagged at Mater Calvary.
The biological clock is still ticking toward puberty, while the visual system now begins its own distinct, subtle degradation.
It's a multi-system convergence, but it's moving at a pace so microscopic, so slow, that it effectively disguises itself as normal childhood development.
Yes, getting glasses doesn't scream rare genetic syndrome. It just looks like growing up.
It is perfectly disguised until the clock finally strikes.
The conditional logic statement given by the physicians that his metabolic trajectory depended on how his hormones responded to puberty was not a hypothesis.
Yeah.
It was a biological certainty waiting for a chemical trigger. Ben Sheargold details the exact moment the biological clock, set a full decade prior at Waratah, finally triggers.
And it happened precisely 1 week after his 16th birthday.
16 years in 1 week. The exactitude of that timestamp is just staggering.
It's the moment the conditional logic statement handed down at Mater Calvary Hospital reaches its inevitable, devastating conclusion.
Puberty hits. The hormonal shifts surge through his body, fundamentally altering the chemical environment, and the if-then parameter established at age 4 executes.
The systemic stress of adolescence overwhelms whatever residual pancreatic function he had left.
The baseline shifts permanently. Exactly 1 week after turning 16, Ben Sheargold is formally diagnosed with insulin-dependent type 1 diabetes.
Let's talk about the mechanics of that shift, because the shock to the system here, both physically and psychologically, is immense.
It's total upheaval.
We're talking about moving instantaneously from standard childhood physiology, where your autonomic nervous system regulates its own survival with zero conscious input, to a life governed by a highly rigid mathematical survival matrix.
Right. Before this moment, his body managed its own blood sugar. He ate food, his pancreas released insulin, his cells absorbed energy.
Zero thought required.
Zero. Suddenly, that entire autonomic system is offline.
It is replaced by a completely non-negotiable manual matrix. He details the sudden overlay of this new reality onto his daily routine.
It is no longer about just existing as a teenager. It's about manual systemic regulation.
He is now forced into tracking blood glucose targets multiple times a day. He has to calculate carbohydrate units for every piece of food he ingests with absolute mathematical precision.
And he has to track needle insertions to deliver exogenous insulin. His physical autonomy, in the traditional biological sense, is stripped away and replaced by a regimen of relentless biological micromanagement.
But how does a mind built on absolute data permanence handle that kind of abrupt, permanent shift in its daily operating parameters?
That is the big question.
Because for a neurotypical teenager, a type 1 diabetes diagnosis is almost always met with profound grief, rebellion, denial, or intense emotional distress. It feels deeply unfair.
Of course.
But Ben Sheargold's system processes reality through data. Does his hyperthymetic memory make the transition easier because he's so analytical, or harder because he perfectly remembers the freedom he just lost?
That is the central tension of Chapter 2 in The Autonomous Mind. His system integrates this sudden demand for mathematical survival by stripping away the emotional noise and focusing entirely on the raw physical mechanics of the new reality.
Interesting.
He doesn't afford himself the luxury of denial because his hyperthymetic memory locks him into objective truth. And Ben Sheargold illustrates this perfectly through what I consider the crucible of this chapter, the scene of the old Newcastle Hospital clinic.
Right. To get him acclimated to the new non-negotiable injection protocol, he is sent to a diabetes education clinic.
Now, in pediatric and adolescent medicine, this is standard procedure.
Yeah.
The medical establishment recognizes that forcing a teenager to repeatedly inject themselves with needles is inherently traumatic.
So they have developed a deeply ingrained playbook for softening that psychological blow.
Exactly.
And the scene he describes is incredibly vivid, almost cinematic in its absurdity when viewed through his analytical lens.
We're in the old Newcastle Hospital clinic.
The clinic nurse sits down across from a 16-year-old Ben Sheargold, and she hands him an orange.
She is treating the standard piece of fruit as a tactical training dummy. She patiently instructs him to practice drawing up air into the medical syringe and injecting that air into the orange skin.
She provides a very specific sensory rationale for this exercise, right?
Yes, she explains that the physical resistance of the fruit's rind is a perfect sensory approximation of what it would feel like to push a needle into human tissue, specifically his own belly or thigh.
Now, we have to understand the nurse's intent here. Her intent is entirely benevolent.
Completely. She is attempting to decouple the physical sensation of the needle from the psychological fear of self-harm.
She is utilizing a classic psychological softening technique to ease a frightened teenager into a terrifying new medical matrix.
But the nurse completely misreads the architecture of the mind sitting across from her. Ben Sheargold's system operates on raw binary logic, not emotional placation.
He looks at the orange, he feels the syringe in his hand, and then he looks back at the nurse, and he completely, effortlessly bypasses the psychological softening she is trying to apply.
I want to read his exact quote from The Autonomous Mind, because it's arguably one of the most revealing statements regarding how his framework operates in the face of physical decline.
Okay.
He bypasses the metaphor entirely, stating ironically, "I can do that all day long. I can cut that orange into 1,000,000 pieces with a knife if you want. It's the physical reality of sticking a sharp object into my own body that I have an issue with, not the fact that it feels strange."
That specific moment is the real-world crucible, where Ben Sheargold's autonomous framework is truly forged.
If we break down the mechanics of that quote, it is a masterclass in objective reality overriding subjective comfort.
The nurse is offering him an illusion, basically. A safe, emotionally detached, low-stakes simulation of reality.
And for 99% of teenagers, that simulation lowers their heart rate. It makes the impossible seem manageable.
But Ben Sheargold instantly identifies the simulation for what it is, a distraction. And he rejects it. He demands to interact with the raw reality of the mechanics.
It is an unyielding clarity that I just marvel at, especially coming from a 16-year-old who just had his life upended.
The medical system, by its very default nature, often treats patients, especially young patients, as emotional liabilities that need to be managed just as much as their diseases.
There is this deeply entrenched institutional belief that patients need to be tricked into compliance.
That the harsh, terrifying reality of their disease must be softened with metaphors, with fruit serving as training dummies, and gentle approximations of pain.
But Ben Sheargold's system refuses to be patronized by the medical establishment's standard playbook. He is pointing out the glaring, inherent logical fallacy of the exercise to the nurse.
Right, that injecting an orange, no matter how much the rind feels like human skin, does absolutely zero to solve the biological imperative of injecting himself.
Exactly. He isolates the true variable in the equation. And the variable is not the tactile sensation of a 29-gauge needle piercing a citrus rind.
No.
The variable is the psychological threshold of piercing his own flesh, drawing his own blood, to manually sustain his own life. He refuses to allow the well-meaning nurse to conflate the two.
This is what the autonomous mind truly represents in this chapter. It is the absolute, categorical refusal of emotional and psychological softening in the face of biological decline.
He is demanding that the medical professionals in that room engage with him on the level of stark physical reality, not emotional placation.
It really exposes how much energy standard systems expend on managing our emotions, rather than addressing the core mechanical issue at hand. It's almost as if the medical system is more afraid of the patient's fear than the disease itself.
When we step back and look at the chronological sequence Ben Sheargold has laid out for us, from the borderline hyperglycemic diagnostic at age 4 at Waratah, where the clock was silently set and the data cached.
To the subtle visual drop in 5th grade, where his lens clarity first degraded but stayed above that 5.0% baseline.
Right through to the rigid, non-negotiable survival matrix of insulin dependency at 16 years and 1 week. The autonomous mind shows us that systemic decline is profoundly architectural.
It's a sequence of tightening constraints. And when you view that sequence through the lens of a hyperthymetic memory, it removes the chaos that usually accompanies illness.
It replaces the panic feeling of being ambushed by a chronic condition with a clear, albeit incredibly cold, understanding of biological progression. He teaches us that the variables are always there, logging quietly in the background, simply waiting for the biological logic to execute.
Which brings us to a deeply unsettling yet entirely necessary question for anyone listening to this deep dive right now. Consider your own past medical or physical milestones.
The broken bones, the childhood illnesses that kept you home from school.
The minor visual or auditory shifts, the random blood tests that came back just a little off. We almost always view our personal histories as a series of random disconnected events, accidents of bad luck, isolated incidents, or just the normal wear and tear of growing up.
But if you possessed an internal system capable of logging perfect, uncorrupted data without the blur of emotion or the hazy decay of time, what silent conditional logic might you find ticking away in the background of your own life?
What invisible variables were set in motion years ago, quietly caching data in your cells, waiting for their inevitable execution point? It is a framework that forces you to look at your own biological autonomy and your own history in a completely new, mathematically rigorous light. Please subscribe and like.